Okay, good afternoon and welcome back to the 170th VRPAC meeting. We are now going to get into our, basically the final session, our run through the day. We're now going to go back to start with our Q&A in the afternoon. So Dr. Monto, are you there?
I am, and since we ended abruptly with Dr. Yang's presentation on the various risk-benefit scenarios, I thought we'd start out by having her and her colleague, Dr. Forche, answer any questions that the committee has and then move to a more broad question and answer session involving both FDA and the sponsors. So I see Dr. Offit has his hand raised. Dr. Offit.
Yes, first of all, thank you, Dr. Yang, for a very thorough presentation. Let me ask this question. Were you to include the data that were presented by Dr. Haver, where she found that 40% roughly of 5 to 11-year-olds were seropositive? Your analysis, and correct me if I'm wrong, assumed that all 5 to 11-year-olds were susceptible to illness. She showed that many likely weren't, or at least that arguably were not susceptible to serious illness. So a parent could reasonably say, my child is seropositive, I think they're likely protected against serious illness, there's much still not known about myocarditis, I'm going to choose to wait. I mean, so how would you, first of all, how do you think it would change your analysis, and what would you say to that parent?
Yeah, so you are right. In our model assumption, we do got data from CDC considering the vaccine coverage. Of course, for this group, there's no vaccine for this group. So basically, we account for everyone in this group, consider them susceptible to the disease. But based on what you say, if there is 45% of individuals in this group already have immunity, and then the cases will be, I don't know what about the protection of those immunity, because it depends on, we are not clear if someone tests positive, how will be the protection. So if you assume those individuals have immunity, test positive in antibody, they have the same kind of the protection as the vaccine, then basically you have 45% reduction of all the benefit. But we don't have that data. We don't know if someone tests positive, what will be their antibody titer, how is the protection compared to the vaccine. Because there is also some literature based on for the adult population, actually someone got infected, they still vulnerable to the COVID infection. So we don't have the data for the this child.
But you usually not as if you can develop an antibody response, it's likely you've developed a memory response. Although you're right, I think that you may not be protected against asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic infection. You are probably likely protected against serious illness after a natural infection, which would change your sort of hospitalization rates. But you're right. I mean, that's another piece of information that's lacking. But thank you very much for that answer.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Dr. Offit. Dr. Sawyer.
I'd like to follow up Dr. Offit's question and go back to a question Dr. Carrillo asked at the very beginning that influences this same issue of estimating hospitalizations prevented and ICU stays prevented. And that is the question of children who are hospitalized for some other condition but just happen to have a COVID test done as a part of the routine testing of all admissions to the hospital. I believe Dr. Havers estimated that only 20% of the patients in the COVID net data fit that category, but I'm wondering if you could address how you dealt with this issue in making your estimates.
So
Hong, I'll take a stab at that. I actually hope that someone from CDC might be able to comment a little bit more about how they actually coded those cases, because we don't have the details. We were relying on the COVIDNet data, and so I'm curious if anyone from CDC could comment on that.
Do we
Dr.
have
Havers, I believe you're on mute.
CDC in the group? Another question I'd like to ask CDC is how representative they believe the antibody prevalence is in terms of past infections, because from some of the cohorts we work with, the antibody prevalence is far lower, depending where you are and what the precautions have been. So Dr. Havers?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to take both of those questions. To answer the first question regarding how we determine the proportion of patients that are actually determined that is when they are admitted with a positive SARS-CoV-2 test, if it's primarily related to COVID-19 related illness or incidental on screening. Again, in COVIDNet data, we have detailed information on all of the pediatric admissions that someone has, a trained surveillance officer has reviewed the medical chart, and based on the reason for admission, the chief's complaint, and other information, they determine whether or not it's COVID-19 related illness. If there's any question about it, they add in symptom information, and then we have two physicians that review the reason for admission and other information. We did find that for older children, for adolescents, the admission rate for probably non-COVID related reasons was higher. In adolescents, we found that the proportion was higher than 20% because there was a bigger proportion of adolescents who were admitted for, like, if they were pregnant and we were admitted for labor and delivery, caught on screening, or for mental health like suicide attempts or overdoses. But in the 5 to 11 year age group, we saw it was about 18 or 19% that we think was most likely related to something the primary reason for admission was not COVID-19 illness. Many of the children were symptomatic, even if they were categorized as that, but if they were admitted for an elective surgery or trauma or something else that was sort of more clearly not COVID related. But it is sometimes difficult to tell. So I would say that the rates are a little bit higher. I mean, the rates include all of the positive SARS-CoV-2 tests, the children with positive SARS-CoV-2 tests, but there is a proportion of children that may not have been admitted for COVID-related illness primarily. But again, among the children that are admitted and whose primary reason for admission is COVID-19, we do see a fairly large proportion of patients that have severe outcomes. At least a third of those are admitted to the ICU. In relation to, does that answer your first question there?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. And then Dr. Monto, you had a question about the seroprevalence studies that were looking at the antibodies in children.
At 40%, because I can tell you from some of our own populations that you know very well, it's far lower than that.
Yeah, no, I think that those are good questions, and I think that different methodologies do yield different results. I think, as I mentioned before, these were from national seroprevalence studies we used to select the investigators for this study did select jurisdictions where they had a decent number of pediatric specimens, but they are from residual clinical specimens, so it's children presenting for clinical care. And again, they may not be totally representative of the general population. Most of them are probably in this age group receiving cholesterol screening, which is recommended for children in this age group. And so we don't know that that's that big of a limitation. One other thing I would say is that seroprevalence estimates vary a lot depending on the assay that is used, and this is one that they limited this seroprevalence study to is one that has pretty high sensitivity and generally doesn't wane over time. So that may have given it higher estimates than you would see in some other seroprevalence studies that use different assays. But again, I think there are other data out there, and I would reemphasize that even when the results from this study show that there was a 40% seroprevalence in this particular population. That was over the summer. Even since then, we saw the highest hospitalization rates in the 5 to 11 year age group, in the 5 to 11 year age group in September during the Delta wave. So there's clearly a lot of susceptible children still out there that are vulnerable to severe disease. So I just wanted to make that point as well. So thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Meisner.
Dr. Meisner, you don't have to wait for your camera to come up to start speaking. Go ahead.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Monto. And I have a question also for Dr. Yang. First of all, I appreciate the model that you presented and the sensitivity analysis that you included. And because, as we all know, it's the base case assumptions that are made that determine the reliability of these sorts of a model. But the point that I wanted to make is that I believe you said you took data from the week ending September 11, and I just wanted to point out that that was the peak of the fourth or the fifth wave of this pandemic, and at that time, the rates of hospitalization were in the 5 to 11-year-old group coming from the CDC data was 1 per 100,000. And over the last few weeks, that number has fallen to 0.4 per 100,000. So, and there's some suggestion that this pandemic may be evolving into a pandemic as more and more people acquire immunity from the vaccine and from infections, as has been noted. So, in a way, you've taken the worst case scenario, and it is not really reflective of what we're seeing at the present time. And obviously, it's very hard to predict what's going to happen with this virus. It's no one can say for sure, but I think it is important to look at your analysis. I think you looked at a 10 or 20% lower rate of disease, and that was as low. But the factors are, it seems to be less than 50% of the numbers during the period that you took your base case. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Bonds, please.
Yeah, so in our scenario, we have scenario 2 and 3. The reason we have that 2 scenario is because we think that a future pandemic is uncertain. So the scenario 2 is the peak. We take a peak. So actually, you are right. Our base scenario, September 11, is close to the recent peak. But we do have scenario 3. We take the lowest point. So the lowest point, the incidence rate for the cases is 5% of the September 11. And the incidence for hospitalization is 10% of our base rate in September 11. So basically, we use these 2 scenarios, scenario 2 and 3, as an upper bound and lower bound. Of course, we still cannot totally rule out the incidence can go beyond these 2 bounds, but we think it's less likely. So that is the way we try to see how the impact of the future pandemic will on the benefit risk of the vaccine.
Yes, I think, and I think that's a very reasonable approach, and I certainly respect that opinion. But I will just point out that the hospitalizations are now 50% lower than they were during that time period.
Right.
Thank you, thank you, Dr. Meisner. I'd like to go on to Dr. Fuller.
Thank you, Dr. Monto. This is actually very informative with the modeling and the FDA comments. I have a couple questions, but I'll first ask the one of Dr. Yang. We know that parents are wanting, most parents want to do what's best for their child and is going to make a decision should these vaccines become available based on their particular situation. So I found that your scenarios were very, very helpful. We don't know what's going to happen. We're in an unprecedented pandemic. We don't know if the virus is going to go up or if we just don't know. So your scenarios were very helpful. My question is, with other vaccines such as HPV or chickenpox or others that have been approved, have we ever had the value of this sort of scenario predictions before? And then the other question is perhaps for Dr. Wong about the best system in terms of following long-term what happens. How long have we been doing that to the degree that we can be able to pick up something that is happening at a lower frequency but at a longer term? There's no precedent for this, but I really am comforted by the fact that these are in place. And my question is, have you done this modeling with any other vaccines in terms of, I know we're not in a, and my question is, have you done this modeling with any other vaccines in terms of, I know we're not in a, have not been in a global pandemic with them, but has this sort of modeling scenarios been done before?
So to answer your question, FDA, when we review the product, we always did benefit risk assessment. But for such kind of the formal analysis, no, we don't do this for every review because it just takes a lot of effort. So we usually only do this when there is very challenging issue, also very important. There is difficult trade-off, difficult decision, and then we have this formal analysis.
I found it very helpful, and so I want to thank your team for doing this. And then my question, if I might, Dr. Monto, to Dr. Wong, or do you want me to hold it till later?
Okay, let's come back to that. Let's
okay,
because I just want to get this clarified, and then we still have plenty of time for a broader discussion. Dr. Lee.
Yeah, so thank you for that presentation, Dr. Yang. I think one of the questions I have, I think what troubles some people was the scenario 3 and the fact that what we've seen with the pandemic is sort of a wave, sort of peaks and then there are valleys and so forth. And so then the question is there a point at which this would not really be advised? And I don't know that we can predict that. I guess the other question I have related to this, and I'm really very pleased to see this modeling, is to what extent is there the potential for actually sort of fine-tuning this, not necessarily in this scenario, but in terms of stratification by age and other demographic characteristics, as well as the fact that I think we recognize that the incidence rates, the vaccine efficacy, the death rates, and all those things vary quite a bit regionally, and whether or not those things can be used to sort of help make decisions. Thank you.
Yeah, so that is a good question. So we understand a lot of benefit risk probably is not uniform. So it depends on a lot of commodity and also demographic characteristic. But because for modeling, we do need information. So a lot of this kind of the information, for example, efficacy, we don't have the efficacy for different small populations related to different characteristics. Also, a lot of instance, same thing. For the model input, you also need instance. If you want to do the subgroup analysis, you need to have instance by those subgroups. You need to have efficacy by those subgroups. So that is really, we have a big limitation on the data for that kind of the more subtle analysis. But I think that is a good suggestion, yeah.
Thank you. Dr. Cohen.
Thank you. Dr. Yang, I just wanted to ask about your assessment of the myocarditis cases, and I know that you mentioned several times that it was the highest possible, the highest anticipated rate of myocarditis that you may see in this age group, but based on the presentation from earlier this morning, it seems like the likelihood of this age group having even close to those same rates of excess cases of myocarditis, given they're receiving both a third of the dose, and they have such lower rates of myocarditis in this age group. Anyway, it seems like I believe it was the fourth or fifth scenario where you used even the VAERS number of reports for the 12 to 15-year-olds is a closer estimate of the number of cases of myocarditis you would expect. So I was wondering what your thoughts were on that and how you determined which data to use to support your rates of myocarditis.
Because for myocarditis, we do look at different database, like the data from Vaccine Safety Data Link, also VAERS, the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. And for all those data, we also have our own FDA Sentinel BAT system. So for all those data has a limitation, but for this purpose, we feel like the BAT system use the health claim data is best fit, because for VAERS system, there's no denominator. So the reporting is voluntary reporting. That is not everyone will report that. Also, we don't know what is the percentage. It's difficult. The rate derived from the VAERS data, we feel like it's likely under-reporting because.
But what about in comparison to all of the other countries that have reported rates of myocarditis in younger adults or adolescents? Aren't those also mostly lower than what the best data is reporting?
Yeah, we do also look at the other countries' data. So one thing is different country, different population. So that the data sometimes is not really representative. Also, we are not very familiar and confident with the other countries' reporting system. We don't know what is the limitation, how to really interpret the data, how that will apply to our system. So we feel like maybe Dr. Rich-Fortune maybe can add in more about that.
Yeah, Dr. Cohen, I just want to say that your basic point is correct. The estimates that we're using are likely to be significant overestimates of what the myocarditis rate is likely to be in the age group that we're looking at. There simply isn't any population level data on this age range since it hasn't been used in this age range yet. And so there were very limited options for what we were going to use to ground our analysis. That's why we've tried to emphasize all of the reasons that we do think it's likely to be the maximum possible estimate, and why we estimated scenario 6 to reflect the possibility that we could have a 50% lower myocarditis rate in this age group. We can revisit this as more data are accumulated, but we chose to use the closest age range for which we had national level data to inform those rates and do sensitivity analysis to assess the possibility, the likelihood that the 5 to 11 age range would have a lower rate. That was the approach that we chose.
Thank you, Dr. Portnoy. And I'm going to, after this question, I'm going to try to open this up. We'll continue with the people who have their hands raised, but I'm going to open it up to more general questions. You've been grilled for long enough. Dr. Portnoy.
Thank you. Gosh, I'm a little disoriented because the video is lagging behind the audio.
We can hear you. Okay? Go ahead.
Okay. So I guess my question, I want to go back to the concept of children already having been infected with the COVID and having some immunity already. Do we know how good that immunity is, how protective it is, and how frequently children who've had COVID before get reinfected? We're giving vaccines to patients who are likely to have been infected in the past. We're not going to probably insist that serology be done before we give these vaccines. So a lot of the people who get the vaccine are likely to have already been infected. Do we know how previous infection changes the response to the vaccine, and in particular, how it changes the likelihood of having adverse effects from the vaccine? Do we have any information about that? So Dr. Portnoy, I know that we have some data on the effectiveness of the vaccine when it's given to people who have previously had a case of COVID-19, and the CDC has published an MMWR showing that there is a significantly reduced likelihood of hospitalization when the vaccine is given to people who have previously had the COVID-19 infection. I'm not familiar with studies looking at differences in the adverse event rates. Given that myocarditis is a rare outcome, it may be difficult. Certainly, using claims-based systems, it would be very difficult to reliably identify people who had COVID-19 previously to see whether that was an effect modifier for the adverse events. So that's what I can add. There may be others who could add more as the conversation goes on.
Thank you. Dr. Carrillo.
Thank you, Arnold. Yeah, let me just make one comment reflecting Dr. Portnoy and actually getting back to Dr. Offit's comments about the risk of reinfection and whether or not prior infection, the degree of immunity. Pfizer does have in their briefing package, they make a comment that in the subset for immunobridging, that they saw no cases of infection in any of that subset that had demonstrated prior infection. So one could, it's a small number, but one could say that prior infection was 100% efficacious. At the very least, it's probably as good as vaccination. So that's just one little data point. But for Dr. Yang, you may have said this and I missed it, but your scenarios were done over what time frame?
6 months.
6 months, okay. And so did you assume that the efficacy of the vaccination that they demonstrated at 2 months was going to be in effect for the entire 6-month period, or did you actually use the Pfizer data on adults, which shows waning immunity over that 6-month time frame, at least for infection?
No, so in our model, we did not model the dynamic of the vaccine change, efficacy change. So one of the assumption is we keep the constant of efficacy over the 6 months.
So you assume that the 90% efficacy is going to hold up for 6 months?
But excuse me, Dr. Crow, that was only one scenario that we used that. I'm sorry, Hong, please go ahead. I think you'll talk about the base scenario.
Yeah, so basically, we did not use 90%. 90% is the higher efficacy based on the new supplemental analysis submitted by the sponsor. Our base scenario actually used 70% efficacy. So that data is based on CDC's study, the vaccine effectiveness study, and they look at the period for pre-Delta Delta period of the Pfizer vaccine. So we base scenario, we use 70% against the cases, 80% against the hospitalization.
Well, no, but I'm specifically talking about the cases, which by 6 months, the Pfizer vaccine in adults at least is waning significantly in terms of preventing infections. And you made no assumptions about asymptomatic infections in this population at all either, correct?
So no, so our only look at cases. So it's a symptomatic cases. So our assumption is 70% against the cases. We assume this efficacy 70% is constant over 6 months.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we're going to have to move on. We've got a.
Dr. Monto, could I make one final point?
Discussion time. I mean, our question time. And Dr. Hildreth, I think you've had your hand raised for a while. And again, you can ask questions of anybody at this point.
Thank you, Dr. Monto. My question is related to something the others have raised, which is whether or not scenario number 3, which I asked about earlier, is the one that's most relevant to our current situation. And if the trends continue the way they're going, the emergency for children is not what we might think it would be, and that's just my main concern, is whether or not the scenario you've used to model this is the appropriate one for where we find ourselves at right now. So that was it, Dr. Monto. Thank you.
Okay. Would you like to answer, or is that something?
I can make a brief response to that. This has been discussed a bit so far, that it is unpredictable what the path of the COVID-19 pandemic is going to be from this point going forward. We do recognize that the model is sensitive to the incidence rate for COVID-19. So that is one of the most important factors on what the benefit-risk balance is going to look like. I do want to say that when we built these models, we were trying to make conservative assumptions throughout. I think the one thing that's come up in this discussion that we didn't add as an additional conservative assumption is natural immunity from prior COVID infections, but we think that we're using a very high rate for the risks of myocarditis, pericarditis, and we are looking primarily at the hospitalizations and ICUs for COVID-19. This morning there was discussion of many other implications of COVID-19, that there can be other long-term effects that people in this age group experience that were not included in the model. So overall, we think that we use conservative assumptions, but it is sensitive to the COVID-19 incidence rate. Thank you.
Thank you. And just as a parenthetic comment, we've been assuming that we are on the descending slope of the curve previously, and been caught flat-footed as the rates again went up. So I think thinking that this is going to be the end of the wave permanently is maybe a little overly optimistic. Dr. Perlman.
You're muted, Dr. Perlman. Actually, Dr. Perlman, let's make sure you reconnect your audio, and we're going to go to somebody else at this time.
Okay, Dr. Rubin.
Thank you. I actually had put my hand up for following discussion when you said that
well,
you already had that.
Open. I'd like to get off the That's just the point. Let's open up the question and answer.
So, well, if I could, and this may be a question for Dr. Havers, who may be in the best position to answer it if she's still around.
Yeah, she was, so let's hope.
We've been talking about the risk-benefit analysis, incredibly helpful, by the way, for this for the vaccine. And obviously, there are some close calls here, using it on a population basis. Oh.
I think you're breaking up.
There, somebody, here, Dr. Rubin, I unmuted you because you keep muting it. There you go. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I got muted without touching anything.
Yeah, that's all right.
Sorry.
Take it away.
So I don't know where you lost me. I guess the question is, can we identify a particularly at-risk population that we should have the vaccine for right now among 5 to 11-year-olds, that where it would be important to improve it apart from a population level effect?
Dr. Havers, that's to you.
Thanks for asking that question. I mean, I think
tough call.
That is a tough call. I mean, I do think that we have identified that children with underlying medical conditions are at higher risk for hospitalization and severe outcomes. Although many of the underlying medical conditions that put children at higher risk are very common in the population. So I think that would be very challenging to sort out. We are seeing higher rates of hospitalization and severe outcomes among children of different ethnic groups, as I said, although once we adjusted for underlying medical conditions, that they did not appear to be at higher risk for severe outcomes, conditional on being hospitalized. So I think it would be very difficult to narrow it down to a specific population, although we do know that children with underlying medical conditions are at higher risk. I will point out, though, that a third of the children that are hospitalized do not have an underlying medical condition that is identified prior to hospitalization. And so there are a lot of healthy children.
What proportion of those hospitalized are previously healthy children? Can you guess?
About 30%, a little bit over 30% of the children that are hospitalized don't have any underlying medical conditions in this age group.
Okay, thank you. It's very helpful. Dr. Perlman, can we connect you now?
Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, yeah, so I just had some questions for the sponsor, if I could.
So please. We've let them get off so far.
Okay.
All done.
But I'm back. I'm back.
Okay. So we heard about some of the measurements of antibodies, and what I was curious about is 2 or 3 things. One is, do we have any information about T-cell responses in these children? And second, I know there's some samples drawn at the 6-month mark. Do we have any information about the duration of the antibody? I think that was answered earlier, but I just wanted to confirm that. And the third question is something that was actually raised by in the public discussion, which I had the same question. Namely, what do we know about the degradation of the RNA vaccine with time in these younger children? Is it the same kinetics of degradation as we see in older populations? Do we know anything about that?
Thanks, Dr. Perlman. Let me sort of address the first question. I think the first question was about the nature of antibody we have, or antibody response. One of the first 2 questions was about the length of antibody response. Again, we have 6-month sera drawn, but we don't yet have those data. Obviously, we'll be interested in that. As far as T-cell responses, as you may recall, we've done significant studies in adults, demonstrated robust Th1, CD4, and CD8 T-cell responses. We plan additional analysis with our partner BioNTech in 5 to less than 12-year-olds. We've got about 30 of them. The testing's being done at BioNTech, but we don't have that data yet. And then as far as the stability issue is concerned, or what happens to the mRNA, I don't know that I can speak to anything in terms of the pediatric population, but we know about animal studies where, again, the safety profile was quite good.
Thank you. Dr. Nelson.
Thank you, Dr. Monto. As a practicing allergist immunologist caring for adults and children with compromised immune systems, and in light of the COVID-19 data this morning showing that 68% of the hospitalized patients have at least one comorbidity, I have a couple of questions about some of our higher
Same here.
children. Is there any subset of immunobridging or reactogenicity data for the 20% or 312 in the sponsored data set presented this morning? And do the proposed sponsor post-EUA authorization studies include proactive study of immune responses for children with compromised immune systems from underlying disorders or related treatment? The lessons learned from the rollout in the older age group demonstrated the value of additional doses as early as 2 months after the primary series. Hopefully we won't need to wait 6 to 8 months to know that there are some higher risk patients who don't respond.
In those that are given a third of the dose. So Dr. Gruber, do you have an answer?
Yeah, so let me address the first one. I think the first question was focused on the nature of antibody responses in those with underlying comorbidity, and we do have an analysis of that. If we can bring slide 1 up. This represents a circumstance where you have individuals grouped together as the entire group, as well as those that have an underlying comorbidity listed as yes, and those that don't listed as no. And I think you can appreciate that the nature of the response looks quite comparable, whether we're talking about the entire group, those with comorbidity, or those without. As already indicated, we'll obviously be monitoring real-world evidence as well as antibody responses over time to see about the potential for decline and when a boost might be necessary.
By any sense as to within that comorbidity subset is those that actually have compromised immune systems or were on immunosuppressive treatment?
No, let me be clear about that. These are individuals who did not have immunosuppressive conditions. We do have additional study actually that has started in terms of children with immunocompromising conditions, actually in all the age groups from greater than 2 years of age up to 18. This includes individuals that are receiving immunomodulator treatment for autoimmune disease. It also includes individuals post-solid organ transplantation and those that are post-bone marrow or stem cell transplantation. So we will have some of that data to inform how best to use the vaccine in those populations.
Thank you. Dr. Gans.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I had questions for both the CDC, FDA, and Pfizer, so I'm just going to try and concentrate on some. So one of the big questions that I had—
One or two, no more.
Okay.
One or two questions.
I'll concentrate and come back if we have time.
Right.
Okay. So on page 12 of the FDA report out in 4.5 post-licensure vaccine doses, it describes 125,000 children within this age group that we're considering today, so below or less than 12 years of age, who had received vaccination. I'm assuming it was some off-label use. And we need to understand if there's any safety data related to the doses that were given. There's a lot of data being followed on vaccine status and then cases and hospitalizations. And I think it's very important for us to understand those data. If they're
I think that's a question maybe for the FDA, since it's from their briefing document. I see Dawn Fink coming up.
Hi. As far as I'm aware, we don't have safety data for those individuals. Those were numbers that we obtained from CDC. If there are CDC staff who are on the line who might have information about safety data, they're welcome to comment.
And outcomes data, so the CDC for that?
Hi, I'll respond on behalf of CDC. We do have reports of vaccinees who are less than the age of 12 years. So
we don't hear you.
Dr.
Mike,
Cohn,
is there
we
a
can't
problem?
hear you.
Dr. Cohn, you're disconnected. Her audio is disconnected at the moment, so she's going to have to reconnect. So we're going to turn her off because we're not hearing her. Maybe she'll get the clue.
All right, she'll remember the question. I'll call her back, Dr. Gans. Dr. Moore. And remember, committee members, we're going to have a general discussion. These should be questions and answers and not discussion.
Right.
Dr. Moore.
Hello. Yeah, I'll just leave my video off since we're having problems with that. But this is for the sponsor mainly, perhaps for the FDA or anyone else in the committee here, is that this is a new vaccine. And I'm not really certain I know why it's being administered intramuscularly, but we're seeing pericarditis or myocarditis as a consequence of this in children. I'm just wondering, is there any effort to look at either animal models or to look at is there data from clinical studies that suggest we could give a intradermal injection of this and maybe reduce these side effects? Really an open question.
Well, since it's an open question, let's have a short answer because this is not the question that's in front of us today. So, sponsor.
And Dr. Cohn is back.
Yeah, so I can give the short answer. We have no data about intradermal administration. Intramuscular administration is common for most vaccines other than those that are given subcutaneous.
Okay, Dr. Cohn, let's have your answer.
apologies about that. I have to admit, I was a little embarrassed that I hung up on us. So we do have doses that have been administered to less than 12-year-olds. I don't know how much you heard me say before, but some of those may have been off-label, but they also may have been misclassified. So somebody may have put the age wrong, and so we need to go back and look at that data more closely, which we can do, but we don't have any evidence of adverse events being reported in that age group in particular, and as well as no data on outcomes at this time. We'll look at our data a little bit more closely over the next week.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Cohn. I want to remind the committee that these should be questions for the presenters. We are over time now. I do want to finish all the questions for those that presented on this complicated topic. So I'm going to go to the end of the list, but we're eating into our general discussion on the voting question. Just be aware. So Dr. Rubin. Dr. Rubin, are you there?
Sorry, my mistake. Old hand.
Old hand. Okay, that's a good answer. Dr. Sawyer, is that a new hand?
And this is a question for Pfizer. If I caught the numbers correctly, the original immunobridging population was something over 300 and was whittled down to 264. And I'm assuming that it was the people were excluded because they had pre-existing antibodies showing they had actually been infected. And if so, that gives you a small cohort of 50 or so kids in this age group who we could look at side effects of vaccine after natural infection. And I wonder if you have done that.
Yeah, so thanks for the question. We actually, by virtue of having to test all the individuals who come into the trial to determine whether they're seropositive, it wasn't only the immunobridging cohort. So in the circumstance where individuals came in with prior evidence of infection, either defined serologically or based on having a PCR at the time of immunization, there basically was a little difference in terms of reactions seen in those that were positive versus those that were negative. You may remember back to the adult data where, if anything, individuals who had had prior seropositivity might have a little bit of an increase after their first dose, but interestingly enough, they tended to have a lower response in terms of reactions after the second. And we saw much the same thing here, but across the board, really very little difference.
Thank you. I already have a few more hands raised, and these are, I assume, questions for the presenters, short questions. Dr. Meisner, your question.
Yes, a question for Dr. Gruber, please. As a fellow pediatrician, Bill, I know you understand the concern that people have about the issue of myocarditis, that risk in the 6 to 11-year-old children. And so the question I have for you, did you or is it possible to look for troponin levels or BMP levels in those samples that you got from participants after the vaccine, thinking about the possibility of subclinical myocarditis? Over.
Thank you. As part of the data sets we provided to you today, we didn't obtain samples proximate to vaccination when the risk for myocarditis seems to be greatest, right, within the first several days. However, we are taking a very deliberate approach to try to determine whether troponins, first of all, offer any value in terms of specificity. So we're taking populations that have already been studied to look at their baseline troponins. We know that you can, in some circumstances, see false positives. And while we're doing that, we now are enrolling some additional populations of children as well as adolescents and young adults to then target samples taken at 4 days after the second dose. Once we define the nature of the specificity of the troponins in this larger population, then we would use that to inform how best to look at those troponins. But as of today, we don't have that data. And again, I want to be careful in this circumstance, as I'm sure you can appreciate. We want to make sure we have enough specificity around this so that we don't end up having an erroneous result.
But you can compare the two groups, obviously.
Right. I mean, that's the idea, that basically once we have that specificity and know the instance with which we're potentially seeing a spurious result, then we can better decide the nature of what the data would inform us from the troponins or the samples that we're getting to testing troponins in the vaccinated children.
Thank you. Very focused questions now, Dr. Gans. Only one part question.
Thanks. I had a question about the PRNTs, our sponsor, that were reported, and they were reported against the Delta variant, and obviously we have previous data. So this was presented on the cohort that was studied for their clinical trial for the 5 to 11. I'm wondering how that compares with the 6-month data that we've already collected on other individuals so that we can start to understand how relevant that's going to be going. And then were any of the new variants of concern tested even on experimental basis? I realize these are new tests because some of those are going to start circulating. Well, so it's about variants of concern.
That's okay.
Yeah, so let me answer the second part. We've not tested in the pediatric population the responses to new variants, but you may recall from the discussions we had about the booster not that long ago at an EUA, we described how across the board we have yet to find a variant that seems to escape neutralization. And given, again, let me just show slide 1 just to remind ourselves of what we've seen with the Delta variant. Slide 1 up, please. You can see here that we have very comparable responses for the wild type versus the Delta strain in the target population for this study, and we've shown much the same thing in the circumstance where we've looked at adults. So given this type comparison, we would expect the same thing to apply. So whether it's a Delta variant or perhaps a variant in the future, we would expect good coverage so far.
But these were done shortly after vaccination, so I'm wondering how they compare with the ones that we saw previously, affect the levels. So I'm looking at percent.
Yes, I think the circumstance where we saw some decrease in efficacy was obviously in a circumstance where we were beginning to get into a circumstance, as you've seen with real-world evidence in the Delta variant phase, and although there was some drop in overall real-world effectiveness, it was generally well maintained, particularly for serious disease, and so we would expect the same thing. But again, we'll need to study this, and we'll be able to, by virtue of having obtained the specimens and obviously looking at real-world evidence.
Two final questions, Dr. Nelson.
Thank you. I do believe this is a short one for the sponsor itself. Can you provide us with any additional insight into dose selection? So very appropriately, the 10 microgram dose was chosen based on the favorable immunogenicity and certainly the lowest reactogenicity. Were there any lower doses checked, or was there preclinical data suggesting that maybe lower doses would result in suboptimal humoral cell-mediated responses or perhaps even shorter durability of response?
Yes, thanks for that question. Maybe we can show slide 1. Again, the details, yeah, thank you. So the details of how we went about dose ranging to some extent are included in your briefing document. But you see here represented what we were looking at when we made the decision in phase 1 to move forward with the 10 microgram dose. And that was based on coupling this information where you can see on the left-hand side 10 microgram neutralizing antibody responses as well as 20 micrograms versus what was seen in the 16 to 25-year-olds, which was ultimately, of course, going to be the comparison group for the non-inferiority trial. And it was in this circumstance where we saw the 10 micrograms already was associated with a significant reduction potentially in reactions in the setting where it was already looking like it was going to exceed responses in 16 to 25-year-olds. Now, mind you, take note of what's on the x-axis. This was 7 days post-dose 2, and we know that's the peak after 2 doses, and then there's a decline within the first month. So we reckon that there would be some decline. We reckoned we already had a good safety profile and that we would meet non-inferiority. And as it turns out, we did. So that's probably the best evidence that we chose the optimum dose, because we're at a geometric mean ratio of 1.04 with a post-hoc criteria from the FDA to try to meet that number, with reactions that are below those for fever and chills and a number of symptoms compared to 1625. So we think we have optimized the immune response and minimized reactions.
Thank you. Dr. Carrillo, you've got the last word in the questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Arnold. Yeah, one for the sponsor. I'm assuming that based on the data you've presented that you have no immunogenicity data just at the time of the second dose being given, and wondering whether there's any interest or do you have anything ongoing that would maybe inform whether or not someone who has had a prior COVID infection can get by with a single dose. The other question is, are you looking at different dosing intervals? Because the 3-week dosing interval, quite frankly, seems to be suboptimal, at least in terms of durability of the antibody response.
I was going to disallow the second part, but since it's one of the questions I have, I will allow it.
Thank you, Arnold.
All right, so let me address, since both of you are interested in that last question. We obviously, at the time of the pandemic, were trying to solve first and foremost for providing protection in a short interval of time, and that's why we were very pleased to be able to dose at a 21-day interval, first in adults, and then carry that over into the pediatric population. Obviously, as we think farther ahead to a post-pandemic period, and particularly as we get into very younger populations, it may be advisable and probably will as we get particularly in that first year of life to look at longer intervals as part of a routine immunization series. But we don't have that data now. And then the first question, we don't have data currently on to describe on the immune responses after the first dose, but I think you can get some sense of what happened to adults after the first dose, where we typically did not see neutralizing antibody, except potentially in the circumstance where individuals had prior exposure. But we reckon that, again, particularly given the importance of durability, that 2 doses are likely going to be required to essentially provide full protection.
Thank you, and thank you to the sponsors and to FDA for their presentation. We're now moving into the general discussion leading up to the voting question. Could you, Mike, put up the voting question? It is our one and only discussion topic leading up to the vote. So I think
give me a moment here.
Okay.
I'll put it back up. Some in that sharing screen with us, we went back and forth.
Right.
We accidentally pulled it out, so I'll put it back up.
And
you are looking for our community discussion, correct?
This is a voting question. You can find the voting
it'll be in there. It's in there.
Okay.
So
whatever,
I'll pull it up right now.
You got that has it.
No problem. Coming in now. All right. There, somebody stop touching my slides. There we go.
Okay. I won't have to read it out to you. You can all read the voting question, and this is what we are going to be discussing. This is the overall question that the voting question we're going to have to vote on in a couple of hours, or less than a couple of hours, since we've cut into the discussion time. As a question of process, what we will do is conclude the discussion. We will have the vote, and then for anyone who wants to explain their vote, there will be time to discuss and explain the vote. So you can talk about the voting question and should talk about the voting question as we go through the discussion. But there will be additional time for those who want to explain their votes, not mandatory, but available. Okay, so Dr. Gantz, are you up again?
Thank you so much. I'll just open up, I guess, this conversation with a couple of points. For me, there's very intriguing data regarding the disparities that we've seen in terms of COVID disease and outcomes. And for that, I think it's very impressive that we need to provide some safety net that isn't available otherwise without vaccination and prevention of some of the outcomes we've seen. I think very importantly are some of the learning loss outcomes, not only as it would pertain to loss of school time, which we know is very real in many children's lives, but also in terms of outcomes. And so there's data that is being collected on memory loss and other things as it relates to really the outcomes of COVID disease and trying to prevent further loss in these children. The other things that I think are really important for us to understand as we're moving forward is that it's probably in this age group of people have identified an over-analysis of the outcomes in terms of the one thing that we're sort of looking at, because it was seen in the older children of the myocarditis or any of the cardiac effects, because those rates are lower in this group anyway, and the doses used here are actually lower and more appropriate for these ages. So I think those are important points for conversation, and I think for understanding what is before.
Thank you. A very good opening. Get us on track. Dr. Levy.
Yeah, this has been a fascinating day, and I'd like to thank FDA and the sponsor and CDC and everyone for a very thoughtful discussion. There are a number of broad-based principles here that are converging. One of them was touched on by Dr. Gantz, which is the concept of including children. In fact, there's something called the Pediatric Research Initiative, or PRI, that was passed on the federal level to include children in biomedical research. And we're happy to see that studies are being done because this pandemic is clearly affecting them both directly and indirectly, as we've heard today. And so I very much welcome these data, and in many ways, they're promising. And still, the challenge we face, based on the question that we're confronted with now as committee members, is it's a risk-benefit or benefit-risk analysis. And FDA, has made an effort, taken great effort and presented to us today and taken a lot of questions about these different models. And we see that we can reach different conclusions to some extent based on the assumptions that the models are built on. And one of the factors, of course, is how much coronavirus is circulating in a community at a given point in time. And then other factors as well. What will the actual myocarditis rate be in these younger kids who may be less susceptible to myocarditis? But right now, that's a speculation. We don't know that for sure. And the studies were empowered really to answer that question in the 5 to 11-year-olds. So I'm just pointing out some broad-based themes that are running through my mind as we're having this conversation. It's a very meaningful one. And I also am wondering whether the prevailing conditions could somehow work their way into our recommendations, because after all, that's the spirit of an EUA. It's authorized in the setting of a public health emergency, which we're in now, but one that is fluid. So I'm going to leave my comments there, but I hope they're helpful. Thank you, Dr. Monto.
Yes, very helpful, because we are in a fluid situation, and that's why it's a good thing we've got an emergency use authorization and not an amendment or anything like that to the license. But we are confronted with a binary choice, as indicated in the voting question. And keep that in mind as we move ahead to Dr. Rubin.
Thanks, Dr. Monto. This is a much tougher one, I think, than we had expected coming into it. The data show that the vaccine works and it's pretty safe, at least by immunobridging, and even by some clinical data, some early clinical data. And yet, we're worried about all of these. We're worried about a side effect that we can't measure yet, but it's probably real. And we see a benefit that isn't the same as it is in older age groups. So for me, I think it's going to revolve around two questions. First off, whether there is going to be a use for this vaccine in this age group, and then how the decision gets made to use it within this age group. And I think what sways me here is that is a very sort of personal choice. If I had a child who was a transplant recipient, I would really want to be able to use a vaccine like this. And there are certainly kids who probably should be vaccinated. The question of how broadly to use it, though, I think is a substantial one. And I know it's not our question, but I know we're kind of punting that to ACIP. But I do think that it's a relatively close call. And as Dr. Levy just said, as Dr. Gantz said, it really is going to be a question of what the prevailing conditions are. But we're never going to learn about how safe the vaccine is unless we start giving it. That's just the way it goes. That's how we found out about rare complications of other vaccines like the rotavirus vaccine. And I do think that we are going to, I do think we should vote to approve it.
Thank you, Dr. Hildreth.
Hey, thank you, Dr. Monto. Well, I have several thoughts here. And one of the things that's really been impactful for me is to learn that the prevalence in children might already be 42%, which means that 30 million of the 72 million children in our country may have some form of immunity to the virus already. The other thing is that I was disappointed that the number of minorities in the Pfizer study was such a small percentage of the total, because they bear the brunt of disease and hospitalizations. And it just seems to me that in some ways we're vaccinating children to protect the adults, and it should be the other way around, that if 30 million children already have some form of immunity, they made their contribution to herd immunity already, and our focus should be to get the adults vaccinated to protect the children. So this is a really tough one for me, but I do believe that children at highest risk do need to be vaccinated, but vaccinating all of the children to achieve that just seems a bit much for me. So I'm having some challenges with this one. But those are my thoughts, Dr. Monto. Thank you.
Dr. Sawyer.
So I do, we're all concerned about the myocarditis issue, and I do think the model has overestimated the hospitalizations prevented because of prior immunity and the inclusion of some kids who were hospitalized for reasons other than COVID. But I also think the high estimate of myocarditis is probably too conservative, based on the natural history of myocarditis generally being less common in this age group. I'll paraphrase Dr. Fauci, who said models are what you rely on until you get the data, and then you throw out the models. So the models are the best we have at the moment. As was just mentioned, we are not going to get the data unless we start to use this vaccine. I do think we need it as a tool in our armamentarium for high-risk children, for equity issues, for parents who really would like to protect their children, and because of the long-term, very profound implications of schools being disrupted and the social and educational impact that that's having on her. So I agree that it's going to be a fluid situation. A reminder that an EUA is not a permanent situation, and that could change based on either additional side effect data or depending on what happens with the pandemic.
Thank you. Dr. Offit.
Thank you, Dr. Montes. So I guess for me, it's always nerve-wracking. I think when you're asked to make a decision for millions of children based on studies of only a few thousand children. So I guess the way I struggle, or I try and deal with this, is that it's never when you know everything, you never know everything. The question is, when do you know enough? And I think we certainly know that there are many children between 5 and 11 years of age who are susceptible to this disease, who could very well be sickened or hospitalized or die from it. And then regarding the myocarditis issue, I think there are a number of things that are reassuring. It is reassuring to me that we're giving a lower dose. It's reassuring that the incidence of myocarditis in the 12 to 15-year-old is less than that in the 16 to 29-year-old, and that at least that at least the general sort of class of myocarditis is not generally a phenomenon of the pre-pubertal child, or at least much less so. And we do have efficacy data, 91%. I think that will hold up. So I guess for me, I think, I know enough to move forward with the yes vote. But, it's always never when you know everything. It's when you know enough. So thank you.
Right, and it's a binary choice that's put in front of us, which is always difficult. Dr. Portnoy.
I assume you meant Portnoy. Thank you for the discussion and the opportunity to say this. Technically, I'm the consumer representative, and I've had over 4,000 emails from consumers saying, asking me to vote no. Thank you for those, but I feel like I need to also represent the consumers
the parents that I see every day in the clinic who are terrified of sending their children to school because they're not protected against COVID. There's all this anti-mask rhetoric, parents who don't want to get vaccines. Parents are just terrified of sending their kids to school. And I feel that they need a voice also because they're not being represented. I've looked at the data, and I'm going to use the data when making my decision, because I think that's what we have to do, is to look at the cost and the benefit of this vaccine. I really appreciate the benefit and the risk analysis that was done. It's extremely informative. It really helps to center it. I think of this virus as just the beginning. Our kids are going to be dealing with this virus for many years to come. It's going to come repeatedly, and getting this vaccine is just the first step that they're going to take towards being able to protect themselves from getting this virus and having bad outcomes. So I really appreciate the opportunity to participate in this activity. I think the information has been extremely helpful, but I think that the evidence is pretty clear that this vaccine is worthwhile. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Lee. And please, members, check to see whether you still have your hands raised.
So I would say I kind of agree with Dr. Offit, how much do you know enough? And I would say that I was really sort of impressed with the efficacy data and the immunobridging data. Obviously, the adverse events are always a concern, but they don't seem to be overwhelming really at this point. I will say that the school closures and the disruption, I think, has been enormous. And I think that we have to weigh that against the benefits that we would see for the vaccine. And I think that I definitely think the benefits outweigh that. But obviously, we'll have to follow these kids for some time to see how that happens. I mean, the reality is, I think at one point we thought if we vaccinated enough people, that the virus would go away. It's not going away, and I think we're going to have to find a way to live with it. And I think the vaccines kind of give us a way to do that. Thanks.
Thank you. Dr. Gans? We see you. We don't hear you.
Yeah, thank
Okay.
you. As I was listening to my colleagues, I greatly appreciate their viewpoints. I just wanted to bring up one additional thought that hasn't been raised. You know, the current rates are still within a great deal of mitigation for some of our populations, most of our populations, and we really can't continue to do that. The other thing that we have to realize is we actually have to open back up. And in order to do so, we actually need to provide a way of allowing individuals who are interested in preventive measures and protecting individuals from actually seeing disease, which again, even in asymptomatic individuals who have experienced this disease, there are outcomes that one would not necessarily want for their children. And so we do need to think about that and think about the fact that we can't forever have mitigation, particularly in schools, and children need to return to a more open life as we all do. And so that's an important thing to remember as we're considering those models and rates that we're seeing in those models. Those are with mitigation. So it's important to remember that it likely will go up and we're heading in.
Dr. Pergan.
Thanks, Dr. Monto. Really great discussion by colleagues. I think the thing that continues to stick in my head is I'm trying to put myself in the position of a parent who has a child at particular risk, whether it's obesity, whether it's immunocompromised position, lung disease, that currently does not have the option to give their children this vaccine. And depending on how the ACIP votes on this, this vote will really affect whether they can protect their children. And those are kids that are being held out of schools because masks are not being used in all locations. And I think we have to think beyond how this would be used as a general group, but also to think about those who are potentially at highest risk. And I think that's going to affect how I'm thinking about this decision and voting.
Dr. Kurilla.
Thank you, Arnold. Yeah, so like my colleagues, I think this has probably been, this is probably the toughest decision. And I'll be honest and say I actually resent a bit the sort of binary presentation. It's sort of like a take it or leave it. You must have everything exactly the way the sponsor has presented it and nothing else can be considered. A few thoughts. The argument in favor of that this will lead to herd immunity and reduced transmission, that's a theoretical possibility. I've seen very little data, and in fact, most of what I see right now is that regardless of the percentage in terms of vaccination, the newer variants seem to be able to pass through the population. So if all we're focused on is reducing cases in terms of a benefit, I don't think that's likely to be realized. I have a lot of issues with the immunobridging because it's being based on an immunogenicity marker that we know wanes and yet continues in spite of the waning of that antibody response. We continue to see very good protection against the very things we want to see protection against: hospitalization, severe disease, death. And we're making an assumption that at a lower dose in this pediatric population, that it's just going to pass, that there's going to be equivalency in terms of the overall protection because of the antibody response. So I have a lot of issues with that, and particularly with the percentage of the population that of this population that has already been infected previously with COVID, and I think 40% is probably a lower limit. I think that the possibility that they likely only need one dose at best is going to be very optimal, is probably going to be more than sufficient for them. So I think the idea of doing it under an emergency use authorization, 2-dose for everybody, without any flexibility around this, I think is going to just not go over very well, and I don't think it's going to give the healthcare community the options and parents the options to choose what's best for their children. There are high-risk individuals, and I think they do need to be attended to, that we do need to provide a vaccine for them. But for many others, 1 dose or no dose, even if they've had prior COVID infection, I think they may not need anything more. The last point I would make is that we are vaccinating with a prototype spike protein that is no longer circulating, and so we have to go to higher and higher levels in order to get efficient potency in terms of neutralization. Everyone is focused on Delta right now, but Delta is on the decline. We can anticipate that the future variants are going to be more distantly related, and simply boosting, which we're likely to need to do in this population in 6 months if all we're relying on is neutralizing titers, is going to become harder and harder to do. So I think we need to more carefully evaluate exactly the vaccination schemes that we want going forward, and we simply don't have the data right now to make those decisions.
Thank you. Dr. Levy.
Yeah, I have another comment that relates to how Dr. Marks framed our discussion today. And he was clear to say, look, our purpose today is not to decide who exactly receives it within this age range. Our purpose today as a VRBPAC committee is not to discuss or consider mandates. And that's true, of course. Technically, that's not our job right now. Nevertheless, I'll speak for myself, and I highly suspect the other committee members as well. We have in the back of our minds that after our vote, how this is used, this goes on, could go on later on to CDC depending on outcome, and how it's implemented across states and counties can vary. And, we're hearing from some of the committee members some sympathy to the view that, well, maybe it's good to make this available to certain families, children at higher risk, comorbidities. There have been a number of publications around comorbidities related to severe COVID in this age group, obesity, asthma, other conditions, immunocompromised, et cetera. And is that an option? Typically, FDA wants us to vote on the question, yes or no. Dr. Monto, as you told us, is as phrased. but is there the possibility also of considering rephrasing? We've certainly done that as a committee recently. So I just wanted to share that thinking. Thank you.
Dr. Marks, can I ask you about this? As in front of us, we have a binary choice. That is the question for today.
Yeah, I appreciate the committee's discussion very much here. I also appreciate the fact that we did not present today the emerging epidemiology of COVID across the globe, including what's been happening with increases in Europe and other areas and other concerns. I would ask that we first vote on this question, and then once we have a vote on this question, we can make a determination thereafter if we vote on, if the committee would like to explain their votes, ask for something else, we could potentially either poll the committee or vote on something else. But I think it would be helpful to have a vote on this question.
It was my understanding this is the question for today. Is that the case?
The case.
That is the case. Okay. Let's see. Dr. Meisner.
Thank you, Dr. Monto. An awful lot has been said that's very, very interesting and that I agree with, and I'd like to make a few comments. I think the likelihood that this vaccine is going to be effective is pretty likely in the 6 to 11-year-old age group. The issue is side effects or adverse events that might be occurring after this vaccine. And I'm torn. On one hand, we know that many mothers and fathers and parents are eager to administer this vaccine to children because they're so frightened, perhaps overly so, but they're so nervous about this vaccine because of what's been stated, that they really are anticipating having access to this vaccine in children. On the other hand, I think we saw that approximately 68% of the children who are hospitalized with COVID-19 have underlying comorbidities. So that means about 32% do not. And then if we were to take 40% of that group that may have immunity already, we're getting down to a very small percent of otherwise healthy 6 to 11-year-old children who might derive some benefit. And we simply don't know what the side effects are going to be. We don't, for example, it's not even clear that this vaccine will reduce rates of transmission. We're hoping that's the case, but we don't know. This vaccine is probably not going to prevent infection. It's going to prevent severe disease. So my worry is that I think my thought is that this vaccine should be available for those parents who are very eager to get it for their child, and because their child has a comorbidity, or they're concerned themselves. But I'm just worried that if we say yes, that the states are going to mandate administration of this vaccine to children in order to go to school, and I do not agree with that. I think that would be an error at this time until we get more information about the safety. So I think I agree with what everyone else is saying here. We're in a very difficult decision-making process. Over.
Dr. Marks, can I ask you to help us a little bit? Because we are hearing some reservations about use, and also the question of how various groups that we have no control about over will further act. Yet, if we do not approve, we will be denying the vaccine to families that have a vulnerable member present and who have been keeping their kids in because they're concerned about infecting that individual. We will be denying the vaccine to others who, for one reason or another, want their child to be protected for a risk which we cannot really accurately estimate for all the reasons we've heard up to now. Help us out in terms of if we vote yes, what happens? And clearly, if we vote no, then the vaccine will not be available to anyone. You're muted.
Sorry, double muted. Thanks very much to the committee, and thanks for the very thoughtful deliberations here. I just want to before I get to the answer to that question, just remember here also that we take measures to prevent influenza in children in order to prevent about 100 deaths a year from influenza. And we're talking about having this become more of a routine type of thing. So just so we understand that we're the order of what we're dealing with. The other issue that I would just bring up here is the issue of vaccine equity, in that if we try to approve this for some subset of the group, that could potentially lead to a situation where this becomes a vaccine that gets used more in those who are of a socioeconomic status that they're able to maneuver to receive the vaccine, and would put some at disadvantage. So I think we just need to be careful about where we go with that. And at the end of the day, the way this process has been set up is that it's this body's decision to make sure that the data support the safety and effectiveness, and that the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices then discusses the deployment of the vaccine. I would suggest that we take a vote on the question as it's written, and then if the vote fails, then we can tailor the vote to a subpopulation at that point.
You feel okay? Let's move on to, since you mentioned ACIP, let's move on to Dr. Cohen.
Hi. So I'm reflecting a little bit on the challenging discussion that we're having as a committee. And I think part of the problem is that we're now talking about children. And when we are talking about children, we both don't accept deaths and severe outcomes in the same way that maybe we accept to some degree in older age groups, but we also don't accept risks. And I guess when I look at this question, it is pretty clear to me that the benefits do outweigh the risk when I hear about children who are being put in the ICU, who are having long-term outcomes after their COVID, and children are dying. And as Dr. Marks just said, we vaccinate routinely against several vaccine-preventable diseases for which far fewer deaths and hospitalizations and ICU admissions occur. So to me, the benefit is clear, even beyond the direct benefit and the personal experience that I know we're all having with children in our lives who aren't able to go to school. So then when I look at the risk side of it, I see that the children in the clinical trial, it's not substantially lower than other clinical trials for vaccine preventable diseases, which have evaluated the safety. And we have this known rare adverse event of myocarditis in an older age group with a different formulation of the vaccine. So while I don't want to minimize the risk, I do think that that we could, at this moment, based on the totality of the evidence, the benefits do outweigh the risk. And as this vaccine is used, which I think has been said before, we have incredible safety systems in place to monitor the potential for myocarditis in this age group, and we can respond quickly, as we've shown we've done for every other rare adverse event that our safety systems have identified. So to me, the question is pretty clear. We don't want children to be dying of COVID, even if it is far fewer children than adults, and we don't want them in the ICU.
Thank you. Dr. Lee?
Sorry, I needed to put my hand. Sorry.
Okay. Dr. Fuller?
Thank you, Arnold. So I actually appreciate this question being phrased the way it is, and I'm not going to turn my camera on for broadband purposes. But my question, and I agree with what Dr. Cohen just said, that the long-term risk, if I were a parent of a child in this age group, I would want to have the choice. We can't have the choice unless the vaccine is available. So rather than only the high-risk children, the question becomes, how do we know the risk for any child, and how does the parent make that decision? And so would Dr. Marks or someone remind me, please, of the pharmacovigilance processes that will be done to pick up things that may not have shown up in the children in the trials, but as a parent who's considering this for my child, how will I know as it rolls out in the real world if there's something that does show up? I know we have those. Just remind me and everyone listening what those are so that we can feel confident that if should something come up, it will be detected. I believe that's what happens, but just remind me, please, because I think if we don't make it available, we will never know what will happen with a larger group of people. So I just ask that of Dr. Marks or maybe Dr. Cohen or someone who has that sort of information, please.
Dr. Fuller, thanks for that question. I will start, and then if Dr. Forshee or someone wants to jump in to augment what I'll say. What we have done during this pandemic is we have an overlapping safety surveillance system that is done in collaboration with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. So FDA and CDC share this responsibility. There is passive safety reporting, as we've heard about today multiple times through the vaccine adverse event reporting system. But moreover, there's active safety surveillance, which is done by the CDC system using the Vaccine Safety Data Link, which has about, I think, 14 million lives covered to be able to look in near real time at events that are coming up. And then we have the Sentinel BEST system, which is what we've done, used to evaluate myocarditis in about 20 million vaccine recipients. So that's even a larger system that continues to grow. So we will continue to actively look for adverse events. And I think the important thing here is to say that the safety teams and I can speak for this, in this case for CDC because I know them, and at FDA are incredibly committed and devoted to making sure that we understand the nature of the safety events and that we catch these signals as soon as we possibly can. So that's what we're here to do. Does anyone from my team or CDC want to add into that? Rich, you're muted, Rich.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marks. This is Rich Forshee. I just wanted to quantify a little bit what Peter said. in terms of the best system that we have in place, as Dr. Wong said in her presentation earlier today, that covers somewhere between about 25% to 30% of the people in these age groups, depending on which specific cut you're looking at. So we have a substantial percentage of the pediatric population that's included in our biologics effectiveness and safety system that we can use to monitor for myocarditis or any other potential adverse event that may come up. Thank you.
And just a quick follow-up, and if I have a child that I get vaccinated and I'm really concerned about something happening with him or her, I can go to my primary physician who then will either comfort me or tell me I haven't seen that. They will be basing that decision on what you are looking at in those databases. I guess the question is, how likely is something to get passed or ignored by you? I think that's been a lot of the questions that have come up from other people. It's like all these things are happening, but we have no data for that. Are we missing it, or are there things happening that have nothing to do with the vaccine, but may just be coincidental? So how would I as a parent be comforted by the fact that I know I have a system that is going to allow me to pick up on anything that may be vaccine related?
Thank you. Go ahead, Dr. Marks.
Let me start by this, and then I'll pass it over to Dr. Forshee. So, we obviously, it's very challenging to figure out whether there are what an emerging safety signal is. It is easiest when something is very unusual because it didn't take very many cases of thrombosis thrombocytopenia syndrome to be able to pick that up. We also are able to pick up things like Guillain-Barré syndrome, but these systems do our statisticians are constantly looking at this point, I think it's 16 adverse events, potential adverse events of interest, and I'll let Dr. Forshee say more about that. And those are events that have been seen with other vaccines in order to look for things that might come up and then understand whether there is a higher rate with the vaccine than without. And Rich, maybe I'll pass it over to you to describe that more.
Thank you, Dr. Marks. So I just want to build on what Dr. Marks said earlier about the systems approach that we have here. The vaccine adverse event reporting system is particularly good at catching early, unexpected safety signals that we may see. The BEST system and VSD provide us with systems that are more robust in terms of conducting statistical analyses. The one thing to keep in mind, however, is that there is some lag with events appearing in these data systems. Claims have to be filed, claims have to be made available in the data analysis files that we have. So we do have a robust system, and it has different components to perform different functions. And I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, and I'd like, Dr. Cohen, and when you're done talking about the systems, could you also talk about what ACIP could do with recommendations? Because I think we don't want to overlap the role of ACIP in fine-tuning the approvals that we give and that the ACIP gives, because I think that's where we're going. I'm afraid we may be going in that direction right now.
Sure. So the first thing I'll say is that, whenever we hear the parents whose kids had medical events that occurred near the timing of a vaccine, and it is really, really hard when something devastating happens to your child, and you want so badly to try to understand what's happened. And vaccines, when a vaccine has occurred in that time frame, it can be very, I can see how easy it would be to connect the vaccine with the adverse event. And so I definitely don't want to diminish the way that any parent feels. However, we have several systems in addition to what was just described. We also have CISA, which is a clinical investigation safety team for which a physician can call on at any time, and they have done dozens, if not hundreds, of clinical consults over the past, I guess, over the past 10 months to evaluate potential of an adverse event that is even so rare that it wouldn't be picked up in our safety systems being connected or related to the vaccine. And so this is what has allowed us to really review some of these very rare adverse events and to look at them and to try to, first of all, find another reason for that event to have occurred, which sometimes nobody is able to do. And so you can't completely rule out the possibility of a rare adverse event. That being said, the combination of these safety systems, especially as Dr. Marks was saying, in the setting of a rare an event that occurs very rarely in a population, such as myocarditis in these 5 to 11-year-olds, or any of the other adverse events that have been detected, when we say we look at these 16 or 20 conditions regularly, it's called rapid cycle analysis, and the point of that is to look, nearly every day at whether or not these signals are being detected in our active surveillance systems. So parents have the opportunity to enroll their child. They will have the opportunity to enroll their child in BSafe and report symptoms and report medical events. We have this group of experts to help support clinical decision-making for providers who see rare adverse events or concerns about an adverse event that's related to a vaccine, and in addition to our large safety databases that we look at regularly. In terms of ACIP, I like to say that FDA has the regulatory decision-making over whether or not a vaccine or another product is safe and effective and can be used. The ACIP then takes that those considerations of use or that indication that FDA makes and looks at other variables beyond just safety and effectiveness to look at who would benefit from the vaccine and who should get vaccinated. And so that includes things like equity, feasibility, the indirect burden that we've talked about some today. And so they take, they look at the totality of the evidence and don't just focus, while safety and effectiveness is an important component of that, they look at potential impact of recommendations on a population. And so I think if that helps clarify the difference, I think that I can answer any other questions.
What I'm really trying to get at is a more broad approval or a more restrictive approval, because that is not traditionally what is done in FDA during approvals. So we're talking about population groups to receive the vaccine. How would our discussion that we are having right now impact? I know you can't predict, but how would that impact the ACIP discussions?
Sure. So if the FDA limits an authorization to a population, as you saw with the booster dose recommendations for the mRNA vaccines, based on VRBPAC feedback, then ACIP could not go beyond those conditions of use. So ACIP could limit further, but they can't make the decision to expand that.
But you can limit.
They can limit further. So if FDA authorizes a product more broadly, then ACIP can look at which specific populations may benefit and will benefit from the vaccine and can make more focused or nuanced recommendations if they choose. or they can recommend that the entire population that FDA authorized the product for is recommended to receive it, as you saw in December when we recommended all individuals over the age of 16 or 18 be vaccinated.
Thank you, Dr. Cohn. Very helpful. Dr. Levy.
Error. Sorry, that is an error. Please go to the next.
Okay. Dr. Perlman.
Yes, so after listening to all this discussion and thinking about the ACIP, I'm going to vote in favor of this.
We don't want to have anybody thinking, so, all right. So again, thank you. We were holding off until we want to make sure, we're just going to make a quick announcement that we do have some widespread power outages. So we want to make sure we didn't miss anything with Dr. Perlman. So now that we're reconnected, Dr. Perlman, take it away with your question.
Okay.
Please start from the beginning.
Okay, I'll see if I can repeat that.
If you try.
If I can remember what I said, right. So I was just going to say that I'm going to vote in favor of this question. As I've listened to all the discussion, all of which I basically agree with, it occurs to me that not only are we talking about acute disease, but we're also talking about the other things that Amanda talked about, the effects on families and transmission to other people, and then also long COVID, which may be the biggest problem that we have, certainly in adult populations, maybe in pediatric populations. So I would want to give families the option for getting their children vaccinated if they choose to. The other thing is that even the shedding issue, which is so important for transmission, we don't really have data that there is an effect on shedding, but based on other studies from other coronaviruses and even from animal studies, it's likely that we will see an effect on shedding. And we also, the problem with shedding is that we almost have to do the transmission study to see if people in a household get infected. There may be virus left in the nasal cavity after a vaccine, but the question is the shedding is long or the levels is high? And I think that we don't really have very good data on that. But I think it's so important, as has been mentioned many times in this discussion. And the final thing is that one of the reasons we care so much about the risk-benefit ratios is I think it's really been hard finding much of a risk. Much of it so far has been more based on older populations. So I think the analyses that were done by the CDC were great. But part of the issue is that so far the risk has not been very high in what we've seen.
Thank you, Dr. Moore.
Thank you. So I found the committee discussion on this really, really thoughtful. The way I'm thinking about this is that what are the facts? And we do know that there were 94 children in this age group who died of COVID. All had names, all of them had mothers, and these kids died of COVID. In contrast, we're worried because this group has not been vaccinated before. We're very worried about a side effect which is real, cannot be dismissed. But on top of that, we're extrapolating from higher risk boys and men in older age groups, a side effect from a higher dose vaccine. And that's a theoretical risk, and it's an important one. But fortunately, no one has died from that fits that profile. Now, if the surveillance systems do start seeing severe outcomes and deaths from vaccination, I'm quite confident that those surveillance systems will tell us that we need to pause, like we did with J&J vaccine, to really have a good idea of what the effects are of vaccinating this age group, if we see that. And two, it's also very hard for me to believe that the risk for a severe outcome is going to come close to the known risk that we've seen for this virus in this age group. And laying on top of that, thousands of kids that have been hospitalized, some of them, no doubt, disabled from that, on top of the external costs to parents, to society, to schools, so forth. So to me, it seems like it's a hard decision, but a clear one. Just wanted to throw that out.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pergam.
Yeah, so I keep coming back to this thought that we're in a different situation than we were before, in the sense that one of the biggest concerns, and where there's a lot of hand-wringing about this, is the issue of the question of myocarditis. We didn't know about myocarditis when we talked about this initially in the younger age group, and we sort of learned about this process through this becoming utilized much more commonly. And I think we're going to be very tightly following this. I think the guidelines that have been set up by the FDA for pharmacovigilance are specifically focused on this and other known outcomes. And to me, it feels like that's a really different situation than we've been in when we've gone into populations with basically no knowledge. And I think we have this sort of warning. I think, again, I keep thinking about what Amanda said, Dr. Cohen, specifically about what pediatricians are going through and seeing children dying of a disease that potentially could be preventable. And that when we look at this data, the data we have in front of us is that it can be quite protective for individuals, looking at antibody levels as well as even some of the outcome data. So I think it's really important for us to be thinking about this as we vote, and as well also recognizing that some of the decisions about how this is going to be used are somewhat out of our hands in what happens in the communities and with the ACIP, and we should be voting on the question in front of us and not trying to interpret what will happen with the data.
Thank you. Dr. Kurilla. We have two more raised and then we vote. Dr. Kurilla.
Looks like the camera is burned out again. Yeah, just wanted to make a couple of additional comments. There's a lot of talk about risks, and I think it's mostly been focused on the myocarditis, and that's appropriate. But I think one of the other issues that's not discussed that much is when you're doing a risk-benefit analysis, you have to look at the benefit. And while the benefit here is assumed to be prevention of severe disease, which is what we're all hoping for, my one concern I have is that particularly for that population that has of children that has undergone has experienced a previous COVID infection, which CDC estimates as 40% of this population, which I think is probably a floor. I think it may actually be higher than that. The question really becomes: does this vaccine offer any benefits to them at all? Are they actually very well protected? And the other aspect here is for children who have undergone, for example, a Delta infection, does now vaccinating them with a strain that goes back almost 2 years from the vaccine, from the time they're getting the vaccine, does that actually help or hurt their current immune system with regard to ongoing variants? I don't think we know that. We have no idea. I think for many children who have experienced COVID already, they're probably more than adequately protected. One dose may be sufficient. I think for the high-risk children, it's very different, but I will emphasize again that this dosing interval, the way it was put together, is suboptimal in terms of durability. And I think that there can't be any expectation that the antibody decay rate is going to look any different from the adults, and then these children are going to be expected to have a booster in another 6 months. And I think the focus on cases, reducing cases, is really what's going to confound us, because I don't think we're going to be able to do that. We're going to see vaccine breakthroughs in this population, and it's going to cause all the same problems that COVID does, whether or not they're vaccinated. So I think, I think that we need to be a little more, we have to have a little more flexibility in how this is implemented, rather than as a single dosing reg of primary vaccination scheme that is one size fits all.
Dr. Nelson.
Thank you, Dr. Monto. I understand why the question was asked the way it was, but I certainly don't like it. Accordingly, almost every vote casted today is probably going to be caveated based on the discussion we've had to date. Personally, I see this as an access and really a personal choice and equity question, and not a mandate for all in this age group. I've had to come to that decision, but certainly that's where I've centered and will probably be in favor of this particular question. To me, we should certainly not underestimate the knowledge and decision-making power of the public, as evidenced by the open public hearing comments today, that content, as well as, frankly, thousands of emails some of us have received in the last couple of days. Providing choice to a fully risk-informed public using a shared decision-making model with their trusted providers, to me, is a pretty reasonable way ahead. There are millions of at-risk children and secondarily family members needing risk-informed access to this vaccine for this age group. Unfortunately, I agree with Dr. Krill and the others who were discussing the impact of prior infection and probable existing immunity. Most families in the U.S. are flying blind with respect to their individual status. So in the absence of a testing strategy or having that knowledge, I think we're stuck with where we are and having to provide at least access to the vaccine and giving families the choice to make that vaccination. So to me, depriving access to those at the highest risk could have some very devastating effects and hospitalizations and deaths that will result. So I deeply appreciate the thoughtful approach that the committee has taken thus far in the deliberation. I'll probably be supportive.
Thank you very much. And last word to Dr. Fuller, please.
Thank you, Dr. Monto. I'm just reminded from my infectious disease teaching that we have had vaccines for children before. I'm reminded of the polio vaccine campaign, and Dr. Monto, you might actually even remember more, that people could actually, and children could actually see the effects of polio on their classmates. We cannot see the effects of COVID-19 so dramatically on children, and thus it weighs the question, is it worth the risk? But I certainly believe that in hindsight, when we look back on this decision, giving parents the option to make that decision for themselves will be something that in history we will be glad that we were able to do, and to look at the risk-benefit ratio and say that the benefits of this option far outweigh the known risk. We can't see the disease, but we certainly cannot anticipate all the risk ahead, but we know we have systems in place that can help us do that. So I think we have to take a step and say we want to make this option available for what it might do to help the children as well as others in this pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fuller. So now we come to our vote. After the vote, we will have, for anyone who wants to talk about why they voted and the caveats that are attached to their vote, we will have a chance for anyone who wants to do that to do so. Now I think I have to read it for the record. Is that correct, Kathleen?
Yes, that is correct.
For the record, based on the totality of scientific evidence available, do the benefits of the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine when administered as a 2-dose series, 10 micrograms each dose, 3 weeks apart, outweigh its risks for use in children 5 to 11 years of age?
Thank you, Dr. Monto, for reading that aloud. And just to provide some guidance before we bring up the voting poll, we do have 18 voting members today and 1 non-voting industry representative attending the meeting. So only these 18 voting members, excluding the industry representative as seen on this slide, should be voting. If you are not an official voting member, please refrain as your vote will not be counted. In regards to the voting process, Dr. Monto already read the question aloud for the record, so all of the members and temporary voting members will cast their vote by selecting one of the voting options, yes, no, or abstain. You'll have 2 minutes to cast your vote, and once all of the votes have been placed, we will then broadcast the results, and I will read the votes aloud for the record. And please note that once you've cast your vote, you may change it within the 2-minute time frame. However, once the poll has closed, all votes will be considered final. So unless anybody has any questions, we can pull up the voting pod, please. Great. So the poll is up, and if you can please cast your votes at this time. Okay, it looks like all votes are in, so we can now broadcast the results, and I will read the votes aloud for the record. Dr. Moore voted yes. Dr. Wharton voted yes. Dr. Perlman voted yes. Dr. Sawyer voted yes. Dr. Nelson voted yes. Dr. Levy voted yes. Dr. Fuller voted yes. Dr. Hildreth voted yes. Dr. Cohn voted yes. Dr. Portnoy voted yes. Dr. Pergam voted yes. Dr. Lee voted yes. Dr. Offit voted yes. Dr. Monto voted yes. Dr. Carilla abstained. Dr. Meisner voted yes. Dr. Rubin voted yes. Dr. Gans voted yes. So this concludes the vote. Out of 18 voting members, 17 voted yes, and we had 1 abstain. Thank you, Dr. Monto. I will turn it back to you for the voting explanation.
Thank you. Anybody who wants to further explain their vote, please raise your hand. Cody. Dr. Meisner.
Thank you, Dr. Monto. And I voted yes, as has been stated. But I wanted to make a point. I think that this is quite different than the MMR vaccine, for example. People compare it, say there's a requirement to go to school to get the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine. And that, I don't think, is a fair comparison, because we know that vaccine is safe. We have tested that vaccine for decades.
Absolutely.
And we know, we have a very good sense of what the adverse events are. We do not have that with this particular messenger RNA vaccine. I think there are some children, as has been said, in the 6 to 11-year-old group who are deserving of this and may very well derive benefit, but there are other children who may be at increased risk of myocarditis. Dr. Yang gave a very sophisticated mathematical model, but I just remind people that the rates of hospitalization in this age group of 6 to 11 is 0.1 per 100,000, or less than 10 per million. And the rates of myocarditis in older age groups with a different vaccine, from Israel at least, were as high as 100 to 150 cases. per million. So I think we have to very carefully monitor the safety profile of this vaccine going forward. If the ACIP does recommend it, and hopefully it'll be for those children who have other risk factors. Over.
Thank you, Dr. Meisner. Dr. Portnoy.
Very great. First of all, I want to thank you, Dr. Monto, and the FDA for holding such transparent and scientifically valid committee meetings like this. I think that having an open and transparent discussion like we did today instills confidence in the public so that they can see very clearly that we were very careful in our deliberations, and I think that the decision that we came to was exactly the right one. I'm very pleased with that. I work at a children's hospital. Our hospital has been full for the last month or so with children who've been critically ill. Not all of them have COVID, but many of them do. We have a lot of them in the intensive care unit. I'm looking forward to being able to actually do something to prevent that. I'm looking forward to seeing my patients tomorrow in the clinic because they've been terrified that their children are going to get COVID. Now I have some really good news for them that they can look forward to. So I want to thank the committee for the deliberations. I think we made the right decision, and I look forward to telling my parents the good news.
Thank you, Dr. Portnoy. Dr. Cohen.
Things. I think that, So COVID-19 now is a vaccine preventable disease from my perspective, and COVID is also the 8th highest killer of kids in this age group over the past year. And so the use of this vaccine will prevent deaths, will prevent ICU admissions, and will prevent significant long-term adverse outcomes in children. We will monitor myocarditis very carefully, but I will also say that there have been no deaths from myocarditis, and nearly all of those cases we're doing long-term outcomes have completely recovered just weeks after the onset of their mild cases of myocarditis. So I just really am so grateful that we have this discussion and that the committee voted to approve this, because I think that the benefits in this age group are really super important, even if they are lower per se than older age groups. I think this is an age group that deserves and should have the same opportunity to be vaccinated as every other age.
Thank you, Dr. Cohen. Dr. Levy.
Thank you. I voted yes after some deliberation and hearing the latest phase of the discussion among the committee members and FDA, which was helpful to me. Severe pediatric COVID is not nearly as common as in adults, but it does happen and it's not negligible. It does seem to me that we do need ongoing efforts by CDC and others to characterize the disease in children and to measure and define long COVID in children. There's a lot of work to be done there. My impression is not enough federal resources have been invested in those directions, and I would encourage the system to continue to do that. I think this vaccine will likely be effective in reducing pediatric COVID in this age group and may also help reduce transmission. On the safety end, I'm encouraged by the lower dose, the dose finding a dose that's immunogenic and had not too much in terms of reactogenicity. And then in terms of the myocarditis, it'll be important to keep an eye on that, as Dr. Cohn alluded to, given the surveillance, and yet a priori, it seems the 5 to 11-year age group may be less susceptible to that. CDC, if FDA decides to proceed with this, CDC will take it up and will consider the data with an independent eye in terms of whether they need to direct towards how this would be deployed and how it would be used. I think that, the surveillance systems are going to be critical here, And I'm hoping that this starts off as a campaign, if it moves forward, that starts with choice and parents and their care providers partnering in those decisions. Thank you.
Thank you. And Dr. Rubin.
Assuming the FDA approves and it goes to ACIP, if they produce a recommendation that says that there'll be discretion in how it's used as opposed to a mandate, which I think would all be concerned about at this point, we are going to get plenty of experience with it. The good pharmacovigilance plans, I think, are going to be very useful, and we will know how safe this is. I agree with Dr. Cohn. We want to save the kids we can save. I do think that it will be useful to have a lot more information, though, to determine how best to deploy the vaccine. So I think that we ended up sort of in between. We decided to vote for it with a lot of heavy conscience, but I'm hoping that this is the start of learning more about it.
Dr. Wharton.
So I think this is a valuable tool for prevention of COVID. I know that I've been very worried hearing about pediatric hospitals and pediatric intensive care units being full over the previous several months during the Delta surge in so many communities. So having this vaccine available to prevent COVID in 5 to 11-year-olds seems to me to be a really positive step. And, of course, we will learn more about safety as things go forward, but I think based on the lower background rate of myocarditis in this age group, the lower dose being used, and the evidence that risk is lower in the younger adolescents than the older adolescents together, I think that I am not as concerned about myocarditis in this age group as I am in the older kids. So I think it's a good move forward for COVID prevention and for protecting our kids.
Thank you, Dr. Wharton. Dr. Pergam.
So I really hope that as we think about this, we focus similarly the way we did in adults, that mandates were not immediate after the vaccine was approved. And we see sort of a delay in that sort of approach, because I think there is the safety concerns are things that have been brought up by committee members, and there is some issues that folks have, but we want to make sure that we're doing right by children by giving them the opportunity to get vaccinated as well. So I think that's going to be an important piece as we move forward. And I think you've heard that from committee members, that there is some concern about school mandates and such at the moment. So I think it's important to keep that in mind, at least in the short term. I also think this sort of begs another question that I think we haven't talked about enough, is that we don't do enough in early phases of vaccine trials to include children. And I think, obviously when they're pediatric vaccines, that's different, but I think we need to rethink our strategies and how we do this, because having this data a few months back would have been very valuable as we think about this. And I think I'd love to see the FDA rethink how they want to produce, or how they want to advise vaccine companies about doing this kind of research, because having this in an earlier phase, and I think my pediatric colleagues would agree with this, would be very advantageous.
Thank you. Dr. Hildreth.
Primarily because, thank you, Dr. Monto. I voted yes primarily because I want to make sure that the children who really need this vaccine, primarily the black and brown children in our country, get the vaccine. But to be honest, the best way to protect the health of some kids would be to do nothing at all, because they're going to be just fine. But there are lots and lots of children who, for this vaccine, will be the difference between health and even life. So my vote was primarily to make sure those who really need it can get it. And I hope that the ACIP will prioritize the vaccine in some way to make sure that that actually happens. But that's why I voted yes, is to make sure that those who really need it can get it. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Moore, final comment.
Thank you, Ronald. The one thing that I hope is that this is not a last step, but just a very, very tiny first step. And that I really hope that Pfizer and that the national research agencies, NIH, FDA, CDC, do put serious effort into seeing how we can improve the use of this vaccine, particularly in these younger age groups, or the J&J vaccine, for example. How can that be improved so that the public has more confidence that we are authorizing a vaccine that is as possibly safe and protective as we can get? And I think it's too easy for these institutions to simply say, well, we've gotten over the hurdle of it. It's been accepted in this age group or this risk group. Let's move on to the next thing. I was a little disappointed that the clinical trials for children didn't start until June 1st of this year, whereas this time last year, we were evaluating the clinical trials for 18-year-olds and above for the Pfizer vaccine, and then quickly thereafter for the Moderna vaccine. So I just hope that we can make a little bit better progress on trying to find out how to optimize our tools to fight against this virus.
Thank you very much, Dr. Moore. And just to continue some of your thoughts, this should be not the last step, but the first step in understanding the role of these vaccines in the pediatric age group. We've identified a lower dose, which we expect is going to decrease the frequency of the rare side effect of myocarditis. We may want to look at that dose in other age groups where myocarditis is more frequent. We have approved or recommended approval for a 3-week interval. That's something that we also need to look at more closely. But this is what we have to do now because we are in an emergency, and I'm thank the committee for a very long and very deliberate and very complete review of all of the elements that have gone into our recommending approval of this vaccine for an important age group of children. So over to you, Prabha, to close the meeting.
Thank you, Dr. Monte. Actually, I will invite Dr. Marks to make some closing remarks before I formally adjourn the meeting.
So thank you very much to the entire committee for what were very, very thoughtful deliberations today. I think it obviously is a challenging thing, and I think it all shows how caring the entire committee is about our children. I think everyone here is trying to do their best to weigh the benefits and risks here. Just to reassure the committee, because we are taking an emergency use authorization rather than an approval, in general, although it's possible that mandates could be put in place, I suppose, in general, people have not done mandates with emergency use authorizations, and there are certain governors who have already announced that they would not do a mandate until there was an approval as opposed to an emergency use authorization. Excuse me. So I really appreciate very much the concern here. The other thing I would just like to stress is that the safety monitoring of this vaccine will continue. It has actually been quite intense with a small army of individuals who are very committed to this, and they will continue this. And I do view this as one of our greatest responsibilities to ensure that as this vaccine is deployed and as it continues to be deployed in both adults, adolescents, and children, that we are very actively looking for any safety signals and that we take rapid action, and we do so in conjunction with our colleagues at CDC. So thank you all again for what was a very long day. We greatly appreciate your input and wish you a very good rest of the day.
Thank you, Dr. Marks. This is now to formally adjourn the meeting. The meeting is adjourned at 4:35 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you so much.